They've become known as the Waspies, the Women Against State Pension Inequality. That group, born in the 1950s, adversely affected by increases in the state pension age, which themselves were introduced because of our ageing population. The Waspie argument was that the Department for Work and Pensions didn't fully communicate these changes to them, causing stress and anxiety, in many cases leaving plans for retirement in tatters and even making some destitute. Now, a new and long-awaited report from the Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman has agreed with them and directed the government to pay compensation of between £1,000 and almost £3,000. I'm Niall Paterson. Welcome to the Sky News Daily. So let's start with one of those affected. Michele Carlile was 59 when she suffered a heart attack that left her unable to work and forced her into early retirement. She thought her state pension meant that she could continue to pay off her mortgage and get by. Instead, she soon realised she was in fact years away from the new pension age. And Michele is with me now. Take me back to that point where, having retired from a very senior role in education at 59, because of health issues, that you realised that the state pension wasn't going to be coming to you at the point at which you had assumed it would.
On top of being ill and then having to grapple with the impact of these governmental decisions was huge, because obviously I was very unwell. I couldn't work. I couldn't stay in my home because I couldn't pay my mortgage. I had to rent that out and go and live in my son's flat, which was, extremely stressful. But it was also, impacted on my son as well and his wife. But yes, I did at least have that way of getting through.
Talk to me then a little bit, Michele, about the level of communication that you had from the Department for Work and Pensions. How much did they tell you in advance about what was going to happen?
I don't remember anything. And very importantly, this is not a stage, when I was in my late 50s, when we had such immediate access to media. We weren't on the phones all the time. It just wasn't quite the same world at all. And I heard, I think it was, in fact, from my brother, that this change had been made. No information had come directly to me from the Department of Work and Pensions that I can recall, or, anyone of my age group seems to have any memory of this. However, I accepted that first part, and I think we did, that it was going to be just brought into our early 60s, and that was one thing. It was when, and no word and no way of finding this out in particular, when in 2011 they upped the age of my pension even further. I mean, that was just too much, because I was already ill. I was already, struggling, having to accept I had to wait that long. Now, I was able to get some part-time work, certainly not be able to continue my career as it was. It was just really shocking.
Now, this was obviously a very difficult time for you physically. Anyone who retires, there is a process of transition that happens at that point. To then have this incredible financial stress on your shoulders on top. I mean, did you think that you might lose your house?
Yes, I've been struggling to keep my home the whole time. Exactly that. And now I have come to a point I haven't been able to pay off my mortgage. I would never have paid it off fully, but I would have been a lot further towards paying it off had this not happened. Obviously, that's my ill health and no state pension until quite recently. The last few years I've had it. There's a huge financial loss has occurred here, and I'm struggling today.
And presumably, this sort of stress was not something that you had ever anticipated at this stage in your life.
No, I've had a lot of financial stress, having been a single mother, raising my son since he was 8 on my own, not having the advantage of the more contemporary law on child support, etc. There's also a law about sharing of husband's pension now, which women of my age group were not privy to. We didn't have that. That wasn't around at the time. So there's been a lot of financial stress in my life already. So, having worked very hard, I was looking for a much better phase at this stage. Women rely far more on this state pension because of the fact that we don't have as much opportunity in the private pension, side of things. It's just a ridiculous gap. That should have been taken into account as well.
Michele, thank you. In a moment, we'll be back with Sky's Shamaan Freeman-Powell, who's been following the twists in the Waspi story. Back soon. Welcome back. Look, I will admit that this is not necessarily the easiest story to follow, so let's try and understand a little better how the Waspi campaign got all the way to today and, of course, that Ombudsman verdict. Sky's Shamaan Freeman-Powell is here. Shamaan, take us through the backstory. How exactly did we get to this report?
Well, let's first go back to 1995, almost 30 years ago, right? Government acknowledged that we're getting older, we're living for longer, but we should really be working for longer. And so they suggested that they should increase the pension age for women, and it also, that would bring it in line with the age that men retired as well.
Yeah, so, the old position was
yes.
65 for men, 60 for women.
Exactly that. And when they had proposed that, they'd suggested that they would roll it out in a phased approach, so between 2010 and 2020. So over a course of 10 years. But then in 2011, when the coalition government came into power, they accelerated this rollout and said, actually, by 2018, we now want the men and women's retirement age to be on par. Now, what the main issue is that there was research conducted, I believe, in 2004, which suggested that around 43% of women understood that this increase would directly impact them. So what this report has found is that the Department for Work and Pensions failed to inform these women that they would be directly impacted. So imagine, to put it into perspective, if you're, say, 58 years old and you might have couple of £1,000 in the bank, you think, actually, if I'm going to retire at 60, I could probably retire now because I'm going to be all right. Then they realise, actually, you've got another 6 years until you can reach that retirement age. And women have said that at that age, it's quite difficult for them to find employment elsewhere, and it had a huge financial knock-on effect.
Just so I have this absolutely clear in my head. So law was passed in 1995 that between 2010 and 2020, the women's state pension age would rise to 65. They accelerated the process and basically 2 years were lost. But it's the communication that seems to be at the heart of this, that the Department for Work and Pensions, the government, whilst making these reforms, passing them through statute, didn't communicate the detail of the changes to the women who were directly affected.
No, this is the crux of the problem, right? So it was back in 2006, actually, that it was first proposed that they would start to directly mail women to let them know that their state pension age was about to increase from 60 to 65. But what this report has found today is that the Department for Work and Pensions, I can read it now, failed to provide adequate, accurate and timely information. So it meant that, as I said before, there were lots and lots of women that may have heard about the state pension age increasing, but they might not have known that actually it's going to have a direct impact on their lives.
So when we dig a little bit deeper into the Ombudsman report, what then are their recommendations? Because they are but recommendations, aren't they? They carry no legal force.
What they've said is that actually these women are entitled to compensation. So
it's not much.
No, and I was just about to say the Waspi women were asking for around £10,000 per case, whereas they've said actually it's likely to be between £1,000 and just under £3,000. But what I thought was quite interesting is that they've said that given the interactions that they've had with the Department for Work and Pensions, they've indicated that it would refuse to comply. Now, why that's really interesting is because the Ombudsman have pointed out that it's actually extremely rare that any organisation that they investigate wouldn't comply and act on any of their findings. But you're right, they don't have any legal powers. What's also been really interesting is the idea that if this compensation is paid out, even if it's that smaller figure between £1,000 and just under £3,000, it would still cost the government between £3.5 billion and £10.5 billion.
But that just gives you an indication of how many women potentially were affected by not being made entirely aware.
3.8 million, yeah. And I think as well, when you sort of put that into perspective, part of the reason why the government back in 1995 wanted to address this is because they understood that it's going to cost the taxpayer a lot of money if we're paying for these state pensions. And actually we're getting older, we're being able to work till later. And that's why they wanted to introduce this to cut costs. And now they're looking at potentially paying between £3 and £10 billion in compensations.
You know, I remember being on telly discussing in some depth this. It was picked up by the papers and covered extensively there. Is there not an argument that, you know, if you're planning for retirement and you're that close to retirement, you should probably be more aware of potential changes to your pension plan than some of these women were?
I think it's a valid point. But I do think we sometimes, especially as journalists, we assume that people are constantly watching the news. We may be, but people lead very busy lives. This is our job, so we need to know what's going on. Most people are trying to get through the working week. They're trying to look after their families. They're putting money aside so that they can think about retirement. But are they monitoring the news, looking at every time the government may change the law and these sorts of things? Probably not. And actually, the post office scandal is a prime example of how a huge story can be rumbling on. And actually, people aren't really aware of the intricacies on this. And I think what's really interesting by what the Ombudsman have said is that they have effectively agreed that the Waspi women weren't given enough information about the pension age changes, and that's why they've said that they should be compensated. So whilst you would assume that, you know, if you are interested in this and you want to plan for the future, you may look into this, but our laws are very complicated, and I do think it's not unreasonable to think that people may not have sort out this information.
It is an overused word when it comes to, you know, ombudsman reports, select committee reports. But on this occasion, I think the word damning is absolutely valid. You know, complaints were handled badly, not adequately investigated. People lost opportunities to make informed decisions about their financial future.
They said causing unnecessary stress and anxiety to these women as well.
So what's the DWP's line on all of this? I mean, according to the report, they have not acknowledged the findings, nor have they put things right for those affected.
I think right now, the problem for a lot of campaigners is that there hasn't been a timeline, a timescale set on this. In fact, you've had the Ombudsman admitting that they don't even trust that the Department for Work and Pensions is actually going to act on this. So that's why they've bypassed the DWP and they're going straight to Parliament. Now, there has been some suggestion that Mel Stride, who's the current State for Work and Pensions Minister, may speak on this over the next week or so. But in terms of actual timelines, in terms of money, I mean, this is yet another compensation case. We already have, for example, Windrush campaigners saying that lots of them haven't been compensated yet. I just mentioned the post office scandal, and there's an argument about whether they should be. So this really is the last thing that the government needs to be addressing.
The Ombudsman cannot compel the government to act. It can merely ask. This would require legislation of some sort. You know, we're not that far away from a general election. I'm going to put my hands up here and say, I don't think it's going to happen this side of an election, even if the government were minded to.
This is yet another issue of compensation that the government may need to look for money to sort out. What I actually think is quite fascinating is that the pension age is set to rise again. Right? And this time it's from 66 to 67 for both men and women. And it's going to be between 2026 and 2028. Back in 1995, they suggested a decade-long timescale. Now we've got 2 years. So what I want to hear from the Ombudsman is whether or not they think that something like this is likely to happen again, this time not just affecting women. And you would have some women campaigners that would say if it affects men, it will probably be dealt with.
Just a final thought from Michele Carlile. Michele, as one of those affected, when it comes to compensation, £1,000 to just a little less than £3,000, I'm going to say that's probably not what you were after.
I would like to see this as a starting point for governments, particularly the current government, to really think about, you know, the impact. I know it's a little late in the day and it should have been done before they made the legislation and the changes, but to think about the impact of the way they went about all this that it's had on women's lives. It's been huge, and it's because it's been huge that it's empowered women to push it this far. So I think this is a starting point for negotiation, but I'd be happy with something, I have to say.
How does that make you feel that we have got to this point, that we have the Ombudsman's conclusions in black and white, and that ultimately, for a time at least, not much might happen?
Well, this is the way it's been all the way along, but I have no doubt that Waspi will continue and will not stop, I can tell you, until this is properly resolved in a fair and reasonable way. And the trouble is that the more time goes on, the more women are going to die along the way and not receive anything.
Thanks, Michele. Now, as mentioned, we are waiting for a statement in the Commons from Mel Stride, the Work and Pensions Secretary, which we're anticipating will be coming at the beginning of next week. Until then, a DWP spokesman has said this: "We will consider the Ombudsman's report and respond in due course, having cooperated fully throughout this investigation. The government has always been committed to supporting all pensioners in a sustainable way that gives them a dignified retirement, whilst also being fair to them and taxpayers." The statement concludes, "The state pension is the foundation of income in retirement and will remain so as we deliver a further 8.5% rise in April, which will increase the state pension for 12 million pensioners by £900. That's your lot for this edition of the Sky News Daily. We'll see you again soon.